When I felt his hands on me that night, something inside me hesitated, only for a moment. The scent was familiar but not exact. The touch was gentle, but different. I told myself it was just the surprise, the blindfold, the tension of orchestrating the perfect evening. I told myself it was him. It had to be him. I had planned everything, down to the smallest detail. He was supposed to come home at 8. I had turned off the lights, lit the candles, put on the music we used to dance to when we were still in love. I had chosen the silk robe he once bought me in Vienna. I had tied the blindfold around my eyes with a trembling hand, heart racing with anticipation. I heard the door open. Footsteps. The creak of the floorboard near the dresser. The moment I'd prepared for. And yet, now, 3 weeks later, I keep replaying every second of that night. Every sound. Every breath. And I can't shake this feeling that something was terribly wrong. Because my husband just asked me what surprise I was talking about. He never came home that night. He never walked through that door. And now I can't stop thinking, if it wasn't him, who was it? And why do I feel like I already know the answer? Let me take you back to the beginning. Before the night that changed everything. Before the lie I didn't realize I was living. Before I made a choice I didn't even know I made. It started with a silence I couldn't name. Not the kind that comes from a fight or the weariness of age, but the kind that settles in the corners of a house like dust. A soft forgetting. We still talked, we still ate together. But the touches had grown rare. The laughter, quieter. My husband had become someone I loved more out of loyalty than passion. And maybe that was normal. Maybe that was what people meant when they said, it's just a phase. But it didn't feel like a phase. It felt like I was vanishing, slowly. Like I was becoming the shadow of a woman who used to be alive in her own body. I had always been careful. Conservative in the way I dressed, moderate in my emotions, attentive to his needs. But somewhere between my last birthday and the way he began glancing at his phone more than at me, something began to shift. I started noticing small things, how long it had been since he touched my lower back when passing behind me in the kitchen. How rare it was for him to look at me when we were out with friends. How he'd say goodnight with the lights already off. That night, 3 weeks ago, I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom and stared at the reflection of a woman who had not been kissed with intention in over a year. The thought struck me so hard it stole the air from my lungs. I placed my fingers on my collarbone and imagined them not as mine, but someone else's. I imagined what it would be like to feel wanted again, not dutifully acknowledged, but truly desired. I didn't want to cheat. I didn't even think I was capable of it. But I did want to be seen. And that's what led me to the idea of a surprise. A romantic evening. Just for us. I told myself it was a way to reconnect. That if I could just remind him of who I was, who we were, we could find our way back. I set everything up carefully. Ordered his favorite wine. Cooked the dish we had on our first anniversary. I turned off all the lights except for the flickering glow of the hallway lamp. I laid out the robe and the blindfold on the bed. When the clock hit 7:30, I went upstairs, showered, and took my time doing my makeup. Subtle but purposeful. Something I hadn't done in a while. I sprayed a bit of perfume behind my ears, the one he used to comment on, back when he still noticed things like that. By 7:55, I was in the bedroom. The rope tied loosely around my waist. The blindfold in my hands. My heart was racing, but not from fear, from hope. At 8:02, I heard the door open. Footsteps moved through the hall, slow and deliberate. My breath hitched. I tied the blindfold around my eyes, whispered, "Don't take it off," and turned toward the bed. The mattress dipped. A hand found my shoulder. The air around me shifted. My chest rose and fell with a rhythm I hadn't felt in a long time. No words were spoken. Not one. And I let myself believe it was him. Afterward, I fell asleep with a strange sense of peace. Like I had taken a risk and it had paid off. Like maybe everything wasn't as far gone as I feared. But in the morning, I was alone. The side of the bed where he had laid was cold. A single piece of paper sat on the pillow beside me. "Thank you," it read, in handwriting I didn't recognize. At first, I laughed. Thought it was part of the game. That he was trying to be mysterious. Maybe a little romantic in his own awkward way. Then I heard his key in the lock. He walked into the house carrying a bag of groceries and a folder from work. I remember blinking at him as if he were a ghost. He smiled. "Traffic was awful last night. I stayed near the plant. Hope you weren't too worried." I nodded, mute. Something inside me detached. Floated. Later that day, I asked, careful not to sound too direct, if he had seen the note. He looked confused. "What note?" I watched his eyes. Calm. Clear. Honest. It wasn't him. That's when the truth began to flicker at the edges of my mind. I thought of the touch, the silence, the smell that wasn't quite his. I thought of how I'd planned every moment, except for who would walk through the door. And I started to feel sick. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was pretending. Maybe he wanted to create a mystery. Maybe he was lying now because he was embarrassed. But no matter how many possibilities I conjured, one kept rising above the others like a tide. It wasn't him. Which left only one other person it could have been. That night, I stood at the top of the stairs and listened. The door to the guest room opened. He was here. My stepson. The last person I expected. And suddenly, I couldn't breathe. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts darting like birds in a storm. Every sound in the house became suspicious, the creak of the stairs, the shifting of wood, the quiet knock of wind against the windows. I listened so closely it made my ears ache, searching for something I couldn't name. My husband was snoring softly beside me, completely unaware that the woman next to him was barely holding herself together. I had always been good at keeping things in. Emotions, doubts, fears. But this wasn't a feeling I could hide behind routine or small smiles. This was something far more dangerous. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I made breakfast, asked about his meetings, nodded in all the right places. But I couldn't stop watching him. The way he moved, the way he poured his coffee, how he didn't seem to notice the way my hands trembled slightly as I sliced the bread. If he suspected anything, he didn't show it. That only made it worse. He left shortly after, briefcase in hand, leaving behind the soft smell of aftershave and a kiss on my cheek that felt more like a formality than affection. The moment the door closed, I exhaled for the first time in hours. I stood in the kitchen, still in my robe, staring at the untouched breakfast. I couldn't bring myself to eat. I went upstairs and opened the guest room door. It was empty, made up neatly like no one had slept there at all. The bedspread was smooth, the air stale. I looked for signs, anything that might confirm what my gut was telling me, but everything appeared normal. Too normal. I stepped inside slowly, as if expecting the room to shift under my feet. But it didn't. It was just a room. Until I saw it. On the windowsill sat a small, clear drinking glass. I knew it hadn't been there before. I had cleaned this room just last week. No one had stayed in it for months. I picked it up and turned it in my hands. Lip marks. one edge faintly smudged with the kind of burgundy lipstick I had worn that night. My heart pounded so hard it made my hands shake. I didn't remember bringing a glass into the room. But someone had. The sound of the front door opening jolted me. I put the glass back and stepped out quickly, smoothing my expression as I descended the stairs. He was there. My husband's son from his first marriage. He stood in the hallway like he belonged there, holding a small duffel bag and a casual smile. "Just in town for a few days," he said. "Hope that's okay." I nodded, the movement stiff. "Of course." He walked past me, up the stairs, as though everything was perfectly normal. As though I wasn't barely holding myself upright. I heard his door shut. I stood there, my hand still resting on the banister, trying to catch my breath. All day, I tried to avoid him. I kept myself busy, laundry, cleaning, organizing drawers that didn't need organizing. But every corner of the house felt like it was pressing in on me. I was acutely aware of where he was every time he moved, the sound of his footsteps above me. Later that evening, I was folding towels in the laundry room when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned slowly, already knowing who it would be. He stood there, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me. "You always did keep this house spotless," he said, voice casual, but his eyes too focused. I swallowed. Old habits. There was a pause. A long one. "I heard Dad didn't make it home that night," he said. "That must have been disappointing." The words hit me like a punch. They were coded in something, sarcasm, maybe, or worse, awareness. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I folded the towel in my hands, slowly, methodically. He took a step into the room. Funny, though. House looked like someone was here. Still, I said nothing. I kept my eyes on the fabric. Wine glasses in the sink. Candle wax on the floor. "You planning a surprise or something?" I looked up, finally, and met his eyes. They didn't flinch. "What are you trying to say?" I asked. He tilted his head. "Nothing. Just making conversation." And then he smiled. That same half-smile I had seen 100 times when he was a teenager, mischievous, knowing, edged with a kind of arrogance that never quite left. He turned and walked away. I stood there for a long time, towel clenched in my hands, breath shallow. The next day, I tried to reason it all out. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe the timing was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew. That night, we were alone in the house again. My husband was working late. I made dinner for one, sat at the table, and forced myself to eat. When I brought the dishes into the kitchen, I saw him standing at the edge of the hallway, just watching. I didn't acknowledge him. I went upstairs, locked the bedroom door, and leaned against it, trying to stop the shaking. But just before I turned off the light, I heard him say, quietly through the door. "We kissed." And then silence. I sank to the floor, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. The room spun. I wanted to scream. I wanted to deny it, erase it, go back and undo everything. But I couldn't. Because he was right. We kissed. The days that followed were a quiet unraveling. Not dramatic, not loud. Just slow and heavy, like something steadily leaking through the seams of my life. I moved through the house like a ghost, my movements mechanical. I folded towels, arranged flowers, wiped countertops that were already clean. Every task was a distraction, a futile attempt to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had. Each time I heard footsteps in the hallway, each time he entered a room, I felt it again, that tightness in my chest, the heat that flushed my skin. Not desire. Not guilt. Something stranger. Like being observed too closely, but unable to look away myself. He didn't speak of that night again. Not directly. But the way he looked at me said enough. It was there in his eyes. That quiet confidence that he now carried with him like armor. A knowing smirk that rose and vanished in seconds. I had always believed that control was my greatest strength. I had controlled my emotions, my body, my expectations. I knew how to manage disappointment, how to quiet longing. But now, I was unsteady. I was uncertain of myself in ways I hadn't been since I was a much younger woman. I found myself studying my reflection longer in the mirror, not out of vanity, but searching. Looking for signs of what he might have seen. What gave him the nerve to step over a line so recklessly? Or worse, so deliberately? My husband noticed none of this. Or at least he acted as if he didn't. He had fallen into the pattern of long hours and silent dinners, of scrolling through his phone while we sat across from each other at the table. He didn't notice the tension in my shoulders, the way my eyes darted toward the stairs when I heard a noise. He didn't ask why I stopped wearing the robe he once complimented or why I sat outside longer each evening, sipping tea long after the cup had gone cold. It was during one of those evenings that I saw him again, my stepson, standing at the edge of the garden, near the old magnolia tree. He wasn't doing anything. Just standing there, watching the sky. But it felt purposeful. Everything he did now felt calculated. I wanted to believe it was just my nerves, my shame coloring my perception. But something in me knew better. I retreated inside, locked the door, and closed all the curtains. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee before anyone else was awake. The silence in the kitchen was comforting, the only sound the drip of the machine and the occasional bird call outside the window. I stood at the sink, staring into the garden, the memory of the night with the blindfold returning uninvited. The way the sheets felt. The way I'd whispered his name, thinking it was my husband. I gripped the edge of the sink, nausea curling in my stomach. Later that day, I decided to leave the house. I needed air. Distance. I told my husband I was going into town to run errands. He nodded absently, barely looking up from his laptop. I didn't tell him I wasn't planning to come back until late. I needed time away from the walls that now felt too close. I wandered through stores I didn't need anything from, let my hands skim over clothes I didn't intend to buy. I watched people. Couples holding hands. Mothers scolding children. Elderly women moving slowly through the aisles, touching everything with quiet care. I envied them their normalcy, their clarity. Eventually, I ended up at a small cafe on the edge of town. One I used to visit years ago with a friend I'd lost touch with. The place hadn't changed much. Same faded cushions, same chipped teacups. I sat in the corner, ordered something warm, and stared out the window. When my phone buzzed, I jumped. It was a message. Just one sentence. No name attached. Still pretending it didn't happen? I didn't need to guess who it was. I turned the phone over on the table and closed my eyes. He was pushing me. Testing how far I would go in silence. How long I could live with the weight of knowing. When I returned home, it was almost dark. The house was dim, quiet. My husband had already eaten. I found the dishes in the sink, rinsed clean, left to dry. I walked past the living room without speaking and climbed the stairs. Outside his room, the guest room, I paused. My hand hovered near the doorknob, not to open it, just to feel its presence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then I heard it, his voice, low, muffled through the door. He was on the phone. She won't say anything. She's too scared of what it would mean. A pause. No, he has no idea. He's blind, just like always. Another pause. A laugh. I didn't force anything. She invited it. She just didn't know what she was inviting. My fingers curled into a fist. I stepped back slowly, walked to my room, and closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, letting the words echo through my mind. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, still. Because the truth was, part of what he said was right. I hadn't invited him. But I had opened the door. And now I didn't know how to close it. I woke the next morning with a strange tightness in my chest, like the air itself had thickened around me. Sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, casting thin slits of gold across the floor. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to pretend that everything was normal. That the day would unfold like any other. That I wasn't living in the shadow of a moment I couldn't undo. But reality has a way of seeping in, no matter how tightly you close the door. I went through the motions of my morning. Coffee. Toast. A short glance at the news. The same quiet kitchen, the same hollow sounds. My husband had already left for the office. I didn't hear him go. Lately, he moved through the house like I did, quiet, distant, avoiding. I wondered if he noticed the shift. If he felt the space that had grown between us. Or if he had grown so used to the silence that it no longer registered. Upstairs, the guest room door was slightly ajar. That detail stopped me. He never left it open. My hand hesitated on the banister. Part of me wanted to walk past it, ignore it, keep descending into the safety of routine. But I turned, quietly, and pushed it open. Nothing looked out of place. The bed was made, the curtains drawn back. The same neatness that had always been there. And yet, I felt it. A presence. A memory lodged in the corners of the room. I walked in slowly, drawn to the desk near the window. There was a notebook lying open. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew it would only bring more questions. But my fingers moved before I could stop them. One page was filled with handwriting, his. Messy, sharp, uneven. It wasn't a diary. It looked more like thoughts, phrases, fragments of something incomplete. But one line stood out. It wasn't crossed out like the others. It was underlined. She created the perfect lie, and asked me to wear it. I closed the notebook and stepped back. My breath came shallow and fast. I felt like a trespasser in my own home, caught in something I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I left the house and wandered downtown, unsure of what I was even looking for. I couldn't go to a friend. I couldn't tell anyone what was happening. There was no name for what I was going through. No guidebook for how to recover from something you hadn't meant to do, but couldn't deny. In the early afternoon, my phone rang. It was my husband. I answered quickly, trying to sound composed. He told me he'd be home late, something about a last-minute client dinner. I agreed, my voice steady, heart pounding. I returned home just before sunset. The house was quiet again. I moved through it slowly, as though the walls might shift if I walked too quickly. Upstairs, I paused outside the guest room again. The door was shut now. That unsettled me more than if it had been left open. I didn't go in. I went to my room, changed clothes, and went to the kitchen to start dinner, though I had no appetite. I made enough for two and left the second plate in the fridge. Out of habit. Out of politeness. Out of something I couldn't define. It was dark by the time I heard the front door open. I froze, knife still in hand, halfway through slicing an apple. I waited for the sound of his voice, but it didn't come. Just the soft thud of a bag being dropped, and then footsteps. When he entered the kitchen, I didn't look up. I focused on the cutting board. He walked past me to the fridge, took out a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. I could feel his eyes on me. "I didn't expect you to be here," he said finally. I kept slicing. "I live here." He laughed once, a quiet, dry sound. "Right." There was a pause. He opened the bottle. Took a sip. "You've been avoiding me." I turned then, slowly. Our eyes met. There was no fear in his. Just curiosity. Almost amusement. "You think I should be doing the opposite?" I asked. He shrugged. "I just thought you'd want to talk about it." "There's nothing to talk about." He tilted his head. "Isn't there?" I looked away. My hands were shaking again. I gripped the counter to steady them. "That night," he continued, "you weren't confused." "Not really." I didn't answer. I couldn't. "You wanted something," he said. "Maybe not from me. But someone. Anyone." That hit harder than I expected. I turned sharply. "You had no right." His smile faded. "Maybe not. But you gave me the chance." The room went quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator. "I'm leaving," I said finally. "Tomorrow." He didn't react. "For how long?" "I don't know." He nodded slowly. "Running doesn't erase what happened." "I'm not trying to erase it," I said. "I just need to breathe." That night, I packed a small bag. Clothes, a book, my journal. I didn't leave a note. I didn't tell my husband. I just drove. But the road didn't take the weight off my shoulders. It followed me, quiet and unrelenting, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I checked into a small inn 2 towns over. The kind of place with flowered bedspreads and chipped teacups. I sat by the window for hours, staring at the highway. The notebook he'd written in, the words on the page, they echoed louder now. "She created the perfect lie, and asked me to wear it." Maybe he was right. Maybe I had created something too perfect. A performance. A marriage held together by routine and silence. A life that looked right from the outside but had grown hollow at its core. But I hadn't asked him to wear anything. He had taken what wasn't his. Stepped into a role uninvited. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes, and let the silence stretch. This time, it felt like mine. The following morning arrived slowly, with a dull gray light filtering through the curtains of the small inn. I hadn't slept. The bed was soft enough, the room quiet, but my mind had refused to rest. I had spent hours listening to the hum of passing cars, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling, trying to calm the storm that had taken residence in my chest. I hadn't told anyone where I'd gone. Not my husband. Not my stepson. Not even the few acquaintances I still kept in town. For the first time in years, I was unreachable. Untethered. And yet, even in that freedom, I felt a weight. A pull that wouldn't let me fully exhale. After a lukewarm shower, I got dressed and left the inn on foot. The town was quiet, just starting to stir. A few shopkeepers lifted their shutters. A man swept the front of a bakery. The scent of coffee and flour drifted into the street, oddly comforting. I walked without direction, letting my feet choose the path. Eventually, I ended up at a park I didn't remember ever visiting. It was small, just a winding path, a few benches, a fountain that no longer ran. I sat, watching pigeons pick at crumbs, and tried to make sense of everything. The events of the past few weeks felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else. A version of me I didn't recognize but couldn't escape. I thought of the blindfold. The carefully orchestrated night I had arranged, believing it would heal something between us. I had wrapped that cloth around my eyes with hope. Not foolishness, not naivety, but genuine hope that intimacy could fix what time and distance had frayed. That if I just reached out, he would meet me halfway. But it wasn't him who responded. And the consequences of that moment had seeped into every part of my life since. I had made mistakes. Not by intention, but by assumption. I had assumed control. Assumed clarity. And somewhere along the line, I had let go of the very boundaries that once kept me safe. Returning home wasn't something I was ready for. But I knew I couldn't stay here long. I had responsibilities. A marriage, still intact on paper. A house filled with silence. A man who might or might not be suspecting. And a boy, no, a man, who carried secrets like weapons and wore his confidence like armor. I returned to the inn by late afternoon. The receptionist nodded politely as I passed, her eyes skimming me with disinterest. I was just another middle-aged woman taking a break from whatever life she didn't want to explain. Back in the room, I sat on the edge of the bed, holding my phone. There were no missed calls. No messages. That didn't surprise me. My husband had long stopped checking in. As long as the essentials were taken care of, my presence wasn't urgent. I wanted to text him. Not to confess. Just to break the silence. But what would I say? That I needed space? That I was rethinking things? That something had happened but I wasn't ready to explain it? None of it felt right. And so I placed the phone back down and stared at the wall. Hours passed like that. The sky turned pink, then violet, then black. I turned on the bedside lamp but didn't move otherwise. My mind circled the same thoughts over and over. And then, just after 10, I heard a knock on the door. It wasn't loud. Not hurried. Just a single, deliberate knock. My heart stilled. I stood slowly, my hands cold. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and froze. It was him. My stepson. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking down the hallway like he was bored. There was no urgency in his posture. Just a patient confidence that chilled me. I didn't open the door. I didn't speak. I backed away slowly, each step heavy. I sat back down on the bed, trying to breathe. A second knock. Slightly firmer. Still, I didn't move. After a minute, I heard him speak, his voice low through the door. We kissed. 3 words. The same ones he'd said before. But now they felt different. Not a reminder, but a taunt. A claim. I closed my eyes. My jaw clenched. Another pause. Then footsteps. Fading. I waited 5 minutes before rising again. I opened the door slowly. The hallway was empty. He was gone. That night, I didn't sleep again. I kept the lights on. I sat in the chair by the window, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the sky as it shifted from darkness to the pale glow of dawn. In the morning, I checked out. I didn't leave a note, didn't speak to anyone. I simply gathered my things, loaded the car, and drove. I didn't go home. Not yet. I needed somewhere in between. A place that felt like neither escape nor return. I ended up at a hotel by the lake, about an hour from the city. It was quiet. Discreet. The kind of place people stayed when they wanted to disappear without being questioned. I booked a room for 2 nights and asked for no housekeeping. The clerk didn't ask why. The room was simple. Neutral walls, soft bedding, a view of the water. I sat by the window, watching boats drift in the distance, trying to remember who I was before all of this. Before the blindfold. Before the silence. Before I let someone else's decision shape my reality. I was tired. Not just physically, but in a deeper, bone-level way. The kind of exhaustion that comes from holding too much for too long. By evening, I managed to eat a small meal. I walked along the shoreline. Let the breeze move through my hair. Let the water remind me that time continues, no matter how still you feel inside. Back in the room, I stood in front of the mirror. I looked at my reflection for a long time. The lines around my eyes. The crease between my brows. The woman who had always tried to hold it all together. I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel wise. I just felt real. And maybe that was the beginning. Not of forgiveness. Not yet. But of reckoning. And that, at least, was something. The hotel room felt sterile by the second night, too clean, too impersonal, too quiet. The silence that I had longed for was no longer comforting. It had grown heavy, pressing against my chest in the same way the walls of my home once did. Still, I stayed. Not because I felt safe, but because I wasn't ready to go anywhere else. I wasn't ready to face my husband, or the eyes that would look through me at the dinner table, pretending everything was in its place. I wasn't ready to walk past the guest room and wonder what lingered in the air behind that door. I spent most of the morning sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed but unmoving, my bag packed but untouched. My phone buzzed once around 11. A message from my husband, asking if I was all right and when I planned to come home. I stared at the screen for a long time, rereading the words until they blurred, but I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to say. That I was thinking? That I needed more time? That I didn't know how to come back to a life I no longer recognized? By noon, I decided to leave the room, needing air. I walked the perimeter of the lake again, this time slower, more present. The breeze was sharp, rustling the dry reeds and carrying the scent of water and pine. A couple passed me on the path, older, walking hand in hand. The woman leaned into him as they moved, their steps in rhythm. I looked away, not out of envy, but something closer to grief. Eventually, I ended up at a bench near the dock, one that gave me a full view of the still water. I sat for what felt like an hour, watching the sunlight dance on the surface, trying to settle the chaos inside me. Every thought seemed to circle back to the same place, the same moment. The night I had orchestrated with such care. The blindfold. The candles. The silence. And then the moment it all began to slip. I had tried to bury the memory in logic. Tried to convince myself that it had been an accident, a misunderstanding. But the truth was more complicated than that. It wasn't that I had wanted it to happen. But I hadn't stopped it either. And now, I couldn't undo it. I returned to the hotel mid-afternoon, climbed the stairs slowly, and paused in front of my room. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts again. I turned and walked back down to the front desk. "I'll check out tomorrow morning," I said softly. The clerk nodded, polite, efficient. She didn't ask for a reason. She didn't need one. That night, I didn't sleep much again. My mind moved in loops, retracing steps, searching for signs, questions, answers I would never get. I kept thinking about what he'd said in the hallway. We kissed. It wasn't a confession. It was a declaration. A boundary crossed and named aloud. I didn't respond to the message from my husband. I didn't send one to my stepson. I didn't owe either of them an explanation, at least not yet. First, I needed to find my own. By morning, I was back in my car. The highway stretched ahead, long and gray and familiar. But I didn't turn toward home. I drove without a plan, letting instinct guide me. After nearly 2 hours, I pulled off at a small town I had never visited before, drawn in by a sign advertising a local art exhibit. Inside the gallery, it was quiet, empty but for one other person, a woman around my age, standing silently in front of a painting. I moved past her, letting my eyes wander from canvas to canvas. Abstract shapes. Stark landscapes. A still life of fruit, rendered in soft, muted tones. But it was one piece, tucked into a corner, that stopped me. A painting of a figure with a blindfold, standing in a doorway. The colors were dark, the strokes sharp. There was something about the posture, the tension in the shoulders, the slight turn of the head that made my throat tighten. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't fate. It was just resonance. Something that hit too close. I stood there for a long time, unable to look away. I didn't cry. But I felt something shift. A small click inside me. Not resolution, but awareness. When I left the gallery, the world felt louder. The wind stronger, the light sharper. I checked into a small roadside motel for one more night, this time out of necessity. I wasn't ready for home, but I was beginning to understand that running had its limits. That evening, I opened my journal for the first time since I had left. I didn't write about what happened. Not yet. I wasn't ready to see the words. Instead, I wrote about how I had felt before it all. The quiet loneliness. The distance that had crept in without warning. The effort it took to pretend I was still content. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the ink smudged under my fingers. And when I finally set the pen down, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Clarity. The truth was this, the damage hadn't started with that night. It had started long before. With silence. With avoidance. With the slow erosion of intimacy. That night had just exposed the fracture. Tomorrow, I would go home. I didn't know what I would say. Or how he would react. Or what it would mean for our future. But I couldn't stay on the edge forever. Eventually, you have to step back inside. Even if the air feels different. Even if the walls aren't the same. And maybe, just maybe, that's where something new could begin. We spent the night together. There is no way to write those words without them falling heavy against the page. They do not beg for sympathy. They do not twist for justification. They simply exist, raw, immovable, final. It happened in the space between hesitation and silence. Not because I wanted it to. Not because I understood what it would mean. But because by the time I realized where I was standing, I had already crossed into something I couldn't walk back from. The morning after, I lay still in the unfamiliar bed, the sunlight slowly peeling away the shadows on the wall. The room was too warm, the sheets twisted around me, the air thick with a kind of stillness that made it hard to breathe. I didn't reach for my clothes. I didn't sit up. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece myself back into a shape that made sense. There were no words exchanged. No awkward goodbye or lingering look. I left the room alone. I moved slowly down the hotel corridor, each step echoing through the empty hallway as though it, too, knew what I had done. Outside, the air was brisk. It helped. The cold had a way of pulling me back into my body, forcing me to feel something other than the dull, muted shame that had lodged in my chest. I walked to my car, hands trembling as I reached for the keys. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, not starting the engine. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for this version of myself. Just an aching sort of clarity. There was no turning point, no precise moment when the wrong choice had become inevitable. It had unfolded gradually, silently, like a tide creeping across the sand. One misstep. One unanswered question. One silence too long. I had told myself I needed space to think. That distance would bring understanding. But what I had found instead was the unfiltered truth of who I had become. Not a villain. Not a victim. Just someone who had drifted so far from herself she didn't recognize the reflection anymore. The drive back home was uneventful. Familiar roads rolled beneath me, the same trees lining the edges, the same bends and turns I had taken for years. But everything felt altered, like the world had been repainted in a muted palette. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same. Quiet, neat, still. But something inside me tensed. The walls no longer felt like protection. They were a memory now, a container for things unsaid. I stepped inside cautiously, unsure of what I'd find. The air was stale, unmoved in my absence. My suitcase remained by the stairs, untouched. The table was set for one. A note sat on the counter. Dinner with clients. Back late. M. I read it twice. Then folded it without emotion and slipped it into a drawer. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because part of me wanted to remember that even as I unraveled, he continued living in the structure of our life. Upstairs, the guest room door was closed. I didn't open it. I walked past it like it was a wound I couldn't afford to reopen. In the bathroom, I washed my face slowly, methodically. The water was cold against my skin, the mirror fogged. I avoided my reflection. I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. I changed into clean clothes and made tea, standing at the kitchen window while it steeped. The sky outside had turned a dull gray, threatening rain. It suited the atmosphere. Heavy. Indecisive. I didn't hear him return. I only noticed when I turned from the sink and found him in the doorway, briefcase in hand, coat still on. "You're back," he said. I nodded. "Got in this afternoon." He walked past me, placing his things down with the quiet efficiency he always carried. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "I wasn't sure if you would come back," he said eventually. "I wasn't either," I replied. We stood in silence. Not angry. Not emotional. Just aware. Two people who had once built something together and now couldn't find the blueprint. He didn't ask where I'd been. I didn't offer. He looked tired. Not from work, but from the weight we had both carried for too long. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room, lights dimmed, blanket across my lap. I stared at the fireplace though there was no fire. I thought about everything that had led me here, not just the night itself, but the years before it. The moments I stopped being seen. The hours we passed each other without touch. The days I convinced myself that contentment was enough. But contentment is not connection. It is not intimacy. It is not love. It is a quiet agreement to keep existing together, even when the core has hollowed out. And now? Now I didn't know what we were. When I went upstairs, the house was silent. I paused outside the guest room again. Still closed. Still untouched. I continued to our bedroom and got into bed, facing away from the door. I heard him enter sometime later. The rustle of fabric. The sigh as he settled into his side. We didn't speak. But we were both awake. The space between us was loud. And for the first time, I understood that coming home wasn't the end of anything. It was only the beginning of what had to come next. The days that followed felt muted, suspended in a quiet rhythm that neither healed nor hurt, but simply passed. My husband and I coexisted in the same space, moving around each other with careful neutrality. The routines remained, meals were cooked, laundry folded, lights turned off before bed, but the intimacy behind them had eroded. We said little. There were no arguments, no accusations, but also no warmth. Just a shared silence we both upheld, like two people tending to the same grave. I couldn't tell if he suspected anything. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he didn't need details to understand that something irreversible had taken root between us. Or perhaps he had chosen ignorance over confrontation, preferring the safety of denial to the mess of truth. I couldn't blame him. Some truths don't heal. They unravel. I had hoped that coming home would bring clarity, some kind of direction. But the more time I spent in the house, the more I felt like a stranger in it. The walls held too many memories. The guest room door remained closed, untouched. I avoided it like a wound I couldn't bear to look at. Even walking past it felt like a betrayal of him, of myself, of the person I used to be. My days became quiet, almost mechanical. I spent long hours in the garden, pulling weeds that had barely grown, trimming hedges that didn't need trimming. I swept the patio twice in one afternoon, just to stay busy. My hands needed something to do, even if my mind stayed fractured. It was during one of those afternoons in the garden that I heard the front gate creak open. I stood, wiping my hands on my jeans, and looked up just as he stepped into view. My stepson. He walked in like he belonged there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. I froze, the pruning shears still in my hand, my pulse quickening. He said nothing as he approached. Just stood a few feet away, looking at me as if measuring the moment. I wanted to see if you were okay, he said finally. I didn't answer. The words felt too heavy. Too shallow. I bent to pick up the fallen leaves I had gathered earlier, stuffing them into a bag just to give myself something to do. I shouldn't have come, should I? He asked. His voice was softer this time. Almost thoughtful. Still, I said nothing. He sighed and turned toward the house. He's not home, right? I straightened. You shouldn't be here. I know. He didn't move. Neither did I. There was a pause. The kind that stretches too long, where silence starts to echo with everything unspoken. I thought maybe you'd want to talk, he said. Even if just to yell. I shook my head, forcing my voice steady. There's nothing to say. He tilted his head slightly. That's not true. I dropped the bag of leaves and walked past him, heading for the back door. You should go. But he followed. Not close, not aggressive. Just present. Like a shadow that refused to be ignored. I entered the kitchen and turned to face him, arms crossed. Why are you really here? He looked at me for a long time before answering. I don't know. Maybe I thought you'd feel better if someone told you it wasn't all your fault. It wasn't yours to tell. I know that, too. There was a quiet between us that felt different than before. Not tense. Not angry. Just worn out. I'm not proud of what happened, he said, voice lower now. But I'm not going to pretend it didn't. I didn't look at him. I stared past his shoulder, toward the sink, the window, the garden still half finished. You don't get to simplify it. I'm not trying to. Then what are you doing? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm. I think I needed to see you. To know if you were surviving it. Surviving. That word landed harder than I expected. I'm fine, I said quietly. He nodded once. You don't look fine. I turned away, busying my hands with a dish towel that didn't need folding. Please leave. He stepped back. If you want me to disappear, I will. I said nothing. A minute passed. 2. Then I heard the door open and close. I stood there long after he had gone, gripping the towel until my fingers ached. That night, I didn't tell my husband about the visit. There was no space in our conversation for it. We ate dinner with the news on in the background, neither of us acknowledging the silence between bites. When I went to bed, I lay still beside him, eyes open in the dark. I could feel his body near mine, warm but distant. I wondered what he thought as he turned away, what parts of our life he still held on to, and which ones he had already let go of in his mind. In the middle of the night, I woke suddenly, unsure of what had stirred me. The house was quiet, still. I walked downstairs barefoot, wrapped in a sweater, and stood by the living room window, watching the empty street. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry. Not from guilt. Not from fear. But from exhaustion. I had tried to carry it alone. The weight of that night. The silence that followed. The shame of the choices I never meant to make. But even strength has a breaking point. And maybe this was mine. When I returned to bed, my husband was still facing the wall, breathing steady. I lay beside him and closed my eyes. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew the lie was no longer sustainable. And the truth, however painful, was already unfolding. The days pressed forward with a strange consistency, as if time had grown indifferent to the chaos inside me. Everything on the surface continued as it always had. Meals were prepared, the mail was sorted, the plants watered, but beneath it all was a quiet unraveling. I was functioning, yes. But functioning isn't the same as healing. It's just moving forward while pretending you're not dragging the weight of every decision behind you. I spent most mornings alone in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to whistle and filling the quiet with unnecessary chores. My husband left early for work, still caught in the motions of his own life, and when he returned, we exchanged the same pleasantries, the same tired smiles. Nothing between us had broken loudly. There had been no fights, no slammed doors. But something had cracked, deeply, silently. We had become cohabitants of a shared memory neither of us dared to name. Whether or not he suspected what had happened, I didn't know. If he did, he never confronted it. If he didn't, then the gap between us was even more profound than I feared. One evening, while sorting through old papers in the study, I found a photo album we hadn't opened in years. I hadn't meant to look for it. My hands had simply reached for it without thinking. I sat on the floor, legs crossed, and flipped through the pages slowly. There we were, me and him, in better years. Before the silences. Before the distance. Before the secrets. I lingered on a photo of us at the coast, wind-blown and laughing. My eyes were closed in the picture, head tilted back, mouth open in mid-laugh. He was looking at me, not the camera, with a softness I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen. I closed the album gently, suddenly overcome by the weight of everything we had let erode. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the years leading to it. The slow fading of intimacy. The subtle drifting apart. And still, we were here, sharing a home, eating meals together, pretending that whatever had slipped between us wasn't poison. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the ceiling shift from black to gray as morning approached. And when my husband stirred beside me and rose for work, I lay still, eyes open, waiting for the front door to close behind him. When the house was silent again, I stood and moved with purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. I opened every drawer in the guest room, sorting, collecting, organizing. I packed the items he'd left behind, shirts, books, a forgotten toothbrush, into a small box. Each item felt like a needle, a reminder, a piece of something I never agreed to carry. When I finished, I placed the box by the front door. I didn't know when or if he would come to retrieve it. But I knew I couldn't keep holding on to things that didn't belong here anymore. Later that day, I received a text. Not from him. From my husband. A short message. Dinner tonight? Just us. I stared at it for a long time before replying. Yes. The restaurant was one we hadn't visited in years. A quiet place, dimly lit, where the tables were spaced just far enough apart to feel private. I wore a dark blouse, simple jewelry. I looked in the mirror before leaving and saw someone composed, controlled. But I didn't feel elegant. I felt armored. He was already at the table when I arrived, nursing a glass of wine. He stood to greet me, something he hadn't done in a long time. The gesture struck me more than I expected. We talked. Not about what mattered. About work. The weather. A news article we'd both read. It was almost worse than silence. Finally, over the second course, he set down his fork and looked at me with a weariness that mirrored my own. I've been thinking a lot lately, he said. About us. I didn't speak. I let him continue. I know things have changed. I know we've both been distant. He paused, eyes on his hands. And I think maybe we've both been waiting for the other to say something first. I met his eyes. For once, they didn't look through me. I don't know what happened while you were gone, he said slowly. And maybe I don't want to know. My breath caught, but I remained still. I just know that I miss who we were, he added. Even if I don't know how to get us back there. There it was. A doorway. Not of forgiveness. Not yet. But of honesty. I wanted to speak, to fill the space between us with all the things I hadn't said. But I couldn't bring myself to fracture the fragile thread he had just offered. So instead, I nodded. A small motion, but it carried weight. We finished the meal quietly. Not awkwardly, quietly. When we returned home, we walked in together, side by side. The box was still by the door. He looked at it briefly, then at me. You cleaned out the room, he asked. Yes. He said nothing more. Just picked up the box and carried it to the garage. I watched him disappear through the hallway, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing longer than it should have. That night, we didn't talk about the dinner. Or the past. Or the space between us. But we sat on the couch together, not touching, not turning away. Just present. And somehow, in that stillness, something began to shift. Not healed. Not mended. But acknowledged. And that, after everything, was enough, for now. The final morning felt different, though everything around me remained the same. The light through the curtains was soft and familiar, the air held the scent of rain from the night before, and the house, as always, was still. But inside me, something had shifted. It wasn't resolution, too much had happened for that word to apply. But it was a kind of stillness I hadn't known in weeks, a quiet understanding that the storm had passed even if the damage still lingered. I moved through the morning with purpose, not rushing, not dragging. I folded laundry with more care than needed, brewed coffee slowly, sat at the table and drank it hot for once. There was no avoiding anything anymore. No illusions left to preserve. I wasn't trying to undo what had happened. I wasn't even trying to justify it. I had simply reached the point where I no longer wanted to be imprisoned by it. Across from me, the chair remained empty. My husband had left early, as usual. A note on the fridge said he'd be home by dinner. Short. Routine. But it didn't sting like it used to. There was something in its simplicity that I recognized now, not neglect, but habit. We had built a life on rhythm, and somewhere along the way, we mistook that rhythm for closeness. I cleared the table and washed the cup, not out of necessity, but because the ritual of it soothed something in me. Upstairs, the guest room was no longer closed. I had left it open the night before, as if inviting air back into the space that had held too much weight for too long. The bed was bare, the furniture dusted. It looked like any other room again. A place stripped of meaning. And that, in its own way, felt like peace. I took a walk that afternoon. The neighborhood was quiet, the sidewalks slick with remnants of last night's rain. I passed the same houses, the same trees, the same fences I had walked past for years. But the way I looked at them had changed. Not everything in life ends with clarity. Some endings are just acknowledgments, moments where you stop pretending, stop resisting, and simply accept that things are different now. That you are different. Back home, I sat on the patio with a cup of tea and watched the sky turn from blue to gold. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. I listened to the wind in the leaves, the distant sound of a dog barking, the occasional car passing. Ordinary sounds. Anchoring ones. When he returned that evening, my husband entered quietly. I met him in the hallway, and for the first time in what felt like months, we looked at each other without performance. "Dinner?" he asked. I nodded. "I'll start something." We didn't speak much while we ate, but the silence wasn't tense. It felt lived in. Shared. He complimented the meal, I thanked him. He asked how my day had been, and I gave a truthful, if simple, answer. After we cleared the dishes, we sat on the couch. Not touching, not leaning in, but sitting side by side. I could feel the questions he wasn't asking, the ones I wasn't ready to answer. But that no longer frightened me. The truth didn't need to be spoken out loud to be real. It lived in the choices I made now, the presence I offered, the parts of myself I no longer hid. Eventually, he stood. "I'm going to turn in," he said. I nodded. "I'll be up in a bit." After he left the room, I sat alone for a while longer, the quiet around me no longer suffocating. I reached for a notebook, one I hadn't written in since before all of it began. I opened to a fresh page and stared at the blank lines. Not to confess. Not to explain. Just to begin again. I wrote the date at the top. Then one sentence. I am still here. It was not a conclusion. Not a full circle. But it was enough. Later, as I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, I paused at the top, glancing back toward the hallway. The guest room, the bedroom, the past, the present, all quietly coexisting in the same space. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of it. Because I had faced the truth. And I was still standing. That, I realized, was the beginning of everything.